Good evening, everybody. I'm sitting on my front porch with Lyle Paczkowski, and I'll get to his introduction, but I think the audience knows it's January and we're not really on the front porch. Anyway, this time of year, freeze to death being outside, but welcome to what is this, about the sixth edition that we've ran. Introducing Lyle here. Many of you from Kansas, our clientele and our audience will appreciate. He is a farm boy from North Dakota, Vietnam veteran in the 82nd Airborne, got a degree in ag economics, thanks to the GI Bill, and was in business up in North Dakota, and then moved his family in the late 90s to the Kansas City area, and was lucky enough to jump in the telecom space, wireless industry with Sprint, which later became T-Mobile. How many years are you a veteran there with Sprint and T-Mobile total?
24 years.
24 years. Okay. And the reason I brought him on as a guest, first of all, he's going to be one of our featured speakers at our hedge fund launch. And the thing that, when in regards to the business aspect of it and the hedge fund, Lyle, in his career with Sprint and T-Mobile, filed over 400 patents, and over 100 of those patents were in the blockchain industry. And what is significant to me is you can turn on the television daily and see massive confusion in regards to blockchain technology, in regards to networks and crypto and data storage and all those things. And many are confused about it. Many people are very uneducated in the space, and I see all that happen, and mostly in the financial world. And then I meet somebody like Lyle 3 years ago who is seeing this applied and has great wisdom in the area. I think you told me since 2017 you led a lot of continuing ed classes with Sprint and T-Mobile in this space.
That's correct.
Okay. Yep. And so why politicians and regulators are arguing about this space, technology companies and professionals like Lyle are putting the technology to work and see how it ultimately makes life better in a tremendous number of ways. So, Lyle, I'll turn it over to you and interrupt you for some questions along the way here.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be here, and obviously I've been tracking your organization for some time. So this is fun now to come on and be able to talk about to a large degree what are some of the elements that I think are coming forward in the near term, possibly even in the longer term, obviously, but in the near term, that would be of interest to your clients and to your investors. We're particularly interesting to me as a technologist within the T-Mobile organization. I was in a group of 23 PhDs. I was the only one that wasn't. That studied basically anything that's coming around the corner, the 2 to 5 year span. And obviously things like Koehn, Hyperledger, distributed ledger technologies, Web3 and Web3 and 6G are all really intertwined. And the topics that we'll talk about today and probably in subsequent podcasts are all related. And so one of the things that we wanted to think about today in this particular podcast was kind of open up the topic about how do you appraise technology relative to where a coin is going. You mentioned there's a lot of confusion about Bitcoin and blockchain. Certainly there is. The technology is quite simple. Blockchain is just nothing more than consented data, perfected in this truth. Assuming the application is truthful that made it. And a lot of organizations are looking at derivatives of Hyperledger, distributed ledger technologies, and obviously Koehn to actually structure their corporate strategy going forward. They're having to evaluate the supply chain, evaluate the needs of their customers, evaluate how they actually make money and keep money. And basically, your objective as a business is to make more money than you spend. And so they're looking at these various ways of currency and money. And obviously, we know that the federal government is, the Federal Reserve is, the Office of the Comptroller is, and there's going to be some regulations that come about, I think, in my view, positive for how we change the notion of fiat. We have a few, probably a few of our elected officials who don't understand blockchain or Bitcoin, just like many people don't in the general population. So I think what I'd want to do to start kind of the ball rolling here is how did we at T-Mobile or Sprint, and how do other carriers, and really how do technology companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon look at what is the next iteration of technology and how do you invest in it? And there's a 4-quadrant approach that we use quite well, and it involves 4 pieces, 4 individual components and chunks. And this really affects everybody's daily life. The first quadrant is you have to evaluate what network you're going to be on. Right now I'm on a Wi-Fi network. My mobile appliance is on a cellular network. Everything is now starting to come together and intertwine. So the network is becoming really important. But if you don't have network access, then you're really not in business. And so you have to really evaluate what businesses, how are the businesses making their connection to their suppliers and to their constituents. And it might be something that you really can't do much about because the network is established or very expensive. But you can evaluate how do you use them in terms of the next quadrant in the application. So the second major quadrant that we always would look at is what is the app? What are we trying to do? Voice, in the world of the carriers, voice was always classified as a service, but it really isn't. Today, it is an application. It is data. And so applications are APIs. What is the future state of executables that we can download? An interesting technology, or at least an interesting fact to me, is most of us or all of us either have an Android or an iOS handset. There's 4 or 5 million applications or executables on those handsets, with only less than 0.1% of them being secure. And so now, in terms of an application, what does it do, and how do I maintain privacy and security? That's the service part. We'll get into that in a minute. Then the third major component, obviously, is the hardware. What are the servers? What is the substrate? What does the silicon look like that's being manufactured today? I can tell you, I had a deep relationship with ARM. ARM is in every single cellular device built today. The processors, and they're actually now in Mac PCs and some Microsoft PCs. ARM and Intel and AMD and a number of other silicon providers are really, really important in terms of how do they create systems and services that are technically advanced, don't wear out, and actually can perform a function out of the box. The problem that you have with appliances is that from an organization perspective, you buy capital goods, you usually have a 5 or 7 year depreciation cycle, sometimes 3. The problem with that is that the applications that you're putting on them only have about an 18-month life cycle. So your equipment's got to outlast derivations and iterations of the apps that are upon them. And that makes decision-making quite interesting. In terms of a residential aspect, all of us live in homes. Like in my case, I have 47 Wi-Fi connections. I can't even tell you all the bits and pieces that are hooked. So the appliances with apps on them connect to a network. Then the fourth quadrant, the service. And this is probably the most important because that's the human aspect of how a company delivers goods and services. In the case of Chad's organization, they're a service organization. They provide you intelligence and consulting and decision-making processes upon which you can invest your money. But what they do with that, though, or what you do with that, is you're affected by the prior 3. And so on any major decision point, when you're evaluating technology, in terms of from an investment perspective, or even purchasing it yourself, even at a small level, you have to kind of look at all 4 of those. And the reason for it is most major organizations and some minor organizations, when you ask them what their problem statement is, they'll tell you one big problem statement. The issue with that is that there's actually 4 problem statements within that. And if you can take the big problem statement and break it down into these 4 quadrants, it makes decision-making much easier, smoother, and more accurate, and certainly more profitable. That's my 4-quadrant approach. That's just the opening dialogue, Chad.
All right. Uh, what would you want to tackle first from here forward? You and I have talked about the next web and where you see 5G going, and maybe tie that into the Web3 world, AI and Web3 world. Just keep on going.
Certainly. Certainly. And of course, you make sure you give me my time limitations here, the budget,
By the way,
but
I'll
because we can
interrupt real
talk.
quick, Lyle. It'll be across the screen in the beginning of this, but obviously want to state that this evening we are not giving investment advice nor recommendations, but companies that are publicly traded, you can feel free to speak of them as you have, but just wanted to put that disclaimer in there real quick.
Certainly, yes, and that's a good point. What essentially my conversation today with you and the listeners of this podcast is probably an experience level of being really, really lucky to be really, really deeply involved in technology that is around the corner. Our group, my group, I really didn't care much about tactic. I really thought about strategy. What is the next thing that I want to do? The tactic is easy. The strategy is hard. The one thing about forward-looking strategies, what I always kind of joked about, in 2 years, you're never going to know whether I was right or I was wrong because no one really cares. So you have to be careful about the tactic. Where are you going to put your money? And so some of the areas of emergence that I think are really important, and it's interesting that they all kind of tweak themselves to the same general place. So the next web, Web 3 and Web 2 and Web 3 and Web 4 capabilities are essentially about the same, but the applications and the executables that the current web allows for us to use on PCs are going to be much different. The next web is going to use ledger technologies and IPFS, interplanetary file system, data stores. And for instance, Web3 would allow, like for instance, if you have a Southwest Airlines app today, it's an app that's on your handset. It makes a connection back to some central server in Texas. And I've been to American Airlines' headquarters several times, an amazing place, all these Southwest hearts all over and a lot of red stuff. But the point is that today I order a plane ticket on the PC or on my handset through the app. In Web3, those apps don't exist. They're virtualized, and you think you have the app on your handset, but you're essentially touching a WebSphere server someplace, somewhere, maybe multiples of them, and it's giving you a rationalization of an executable. With that also in terms of the global the World Wide Web consortium, the data structure that's going to support 6G and web is going to be based on blockchain. Now, I'm saying blockchain and not Bitcoin. I'm saying that the data structure is all going to be onion-based, like the interplanetary file system. And by the way, if you've ever heard of IPFS, it was jokingly discussed by Elon Musk one day when he said that someday we're going to be on Mars and we're going to have to figure out a way to move data between Mars and Earth. And so in Switzerland, this was happening to be in Switzerland, and so the coders and the programmers at this conference decided to call it interplanetary file system, and it's stuck. And that is actually the standard upon which 6G technology is moving, in addition to distributed ledger technologies upon which Bitcoin and all the coins are based. So the next web is a big darn deal. It's probably 2 years away. 6G is probably 5 years away. I can tell you this, that all the major carriers, all 200 of them around the world, are already working on standards for 6G. And we're probably going to see some bits and pieces of that in our regular life in the next year or so, as it starts to emerge on certain websites as tests. The next processing platform is a hybrid quantum system. The U.S. is probably lagging China, certainly lagging South Korea in terms of expending money on this. But I worked with a quantum consortium. AT&T right now happens to be, in terms of a carrier, further ahead than anybody in terms of looking at quantum networking looks like. But the next processing platform is going to be a hybrid one. It's not going to be quantum. It's going to be classic compute versus plus quantum. IBM probably leads in that space. And anytime you hear someone say that they can do quantum calculations, you have to view that with a little bit of,
Grain of salt.
are you sure that's what you're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it is the future state. And anyone like IBM, or there's about 4 or 5. Google for sure is in it. IBM has got basically a lead in that space. Um, Amazon and Microsoft are looking at it. But I tell you that in South Korea, uh, Korea Telecom is already doing quantum networking on a 32-mile segment. It's quite remarkable how they are using that system. Quantum only does, it doesn't do computations. What it does is it assigns a probability of something being true. And so if you bake that into technology, the probability of something being true, that's what blockchain is. Blockchain is truth. The blocks that are placed are an image of the asset, the transaction, and the participant. Is immutable and it's truth. You cannot modify it. It stays truthful forever. Maybe just another comment before we kind of slow down a little bit. Everybody calls artificial intelligence the next iteration. I will say that I would like to prefer to call it as assimilated intelligence, because artificial isn't true. Artificial is gaming. Assimilated intelligence is basically taking a lot of data, analyzing it, and establishing new knowledge. And I believe that, and from my perspective, we would look at companies that came in, startups that came in and talked to us about, well, they've got a really good AI platform, an artificial intelligence platform, and we kind of scratch our heads, because we would ask them, what are you using for your fundamental, what is the fundamental criteria upon which you base your coding and your programming? But if you go on past artificial intelligence, you hear a lot about large language, the chat GPTs, those types of systems, and they're relevant. But they, even though a lot of, let's say, pundits would say that they're going to replace a lot of decision-making processes in the future, I'm not certain that that's true just yet. What they do, though, is enhance decision-making processing, and they cannot be discounted. So not investing in those types of things, in my view, would not be probably wise, but investing heavily in them at this point may not be wise as well. Watch that. That's a market that I think everyone in the big spaces, the carriers, are really watching. I can tell you that all the 3 major carriers in the United States are spending great sums of money on trying to figure out how to do large language. Those are the big things. Obviously, the last thing is the next iteration of healthcare. So at that point, Chad, I'll stop for a second.
Okay. Something that something that happens when I talk about with clients the growth and profitability in this space. You know, if you go, when you're looking out in a 5 and 10 year time perspective, maybe technology is safer than what is relatively safe day by day to day. Being in what's profitable, but you get into the weeds of all of this. I have to remind clients this isn't to depress you. I'm talking about where the profitability is. But when you start talking about how scary this all is, I want your opinion. I've never asked you this on back. I remember in the late '80s, early '90s, how technology was supposed to put everybody out of work, and instead it created probably more entrepreneurs, definitely more entrepreneurs than what this nation's ever seen. Through technology, it created jobs, a massive amount of jobs. Do you think that will eventually be that way this time around with these advancements? Because so far, it looks like those statements made in the early '90s may come true. I hear clients whose grandchildren got a degree in something, and it's about been obsolete by the time they get out of school. And in fact, maybe you want to just comment on computer programming and coding. You hear that AI is doing that, a lot of that. It's making companies more efficient, but I also hear of groups that had 35 people that now are down to 5 employees and get more done than what they were doing before. So do you have a vision on that? Will it eventually create more
Yeah,
jobs?
yeah, that isn't, it is an interesting question about machines taking, taking your place in the workspace. I think we're seeing a bit of that as companies today are trying to make more money with their capital investment. Human resources is fickle, it's expensive. Machines always are at work. And we went through the COVID era. We're probably witnessing probably a cultural shift in terms of how people want to work. Work is not a joyful thing. It seems like it's just something to do. I've always enjoyed coming. I've always enjoyed walking through the front door of the business I worked, people I worked for, and I enjoyed going home. You only ever work for yourself, really. You just get paid by somebody else. 4G. So if you ask about, well, technology displaced jobs, I think what they're going to do is possibly shift it. But one thing to keep in mind, 4G, when it was being developed and the standards, and I can't count the number of meetings I sat in terms of trying to figure out what the 4G strategy was and how Sprint was going to take $30 billion in invested in the network. Uber and all of the ride sharing organizations, but Uber was the first. Uber would have never existed if 4G would have never came along. Now 5G, what it's done is taken the ability for fast data transfer, no matter where you are, and converted all proprietary protocols into HTTP, basically the internet. So now we start thinking about things like large language that can potentially evaluate whether or not your 500 lines of code is good, or it can train a robot to do certain things. I think what it represents is eventually a shift in what people do, not people not doing anything. Uh, you know, like in my case, I use large language a lot, and we use large language in T-Mobile to analyze coding. Large language doesn't code, but it can analyze it. Well, to have someone else analyze your code, probably they're going to make the same mistakes. So coders now are taking what they used to do that was time consuming and laborious, and actually are just writing new code for it to be analyzed. In other words, the ability to accelerate knowledge at the human level is going to be a result of technology advancements. Not, I don't believe, a total displacement of what we do, but basically an enhancement of what we do. And I also say this. I believe that our education system should have computer programming and coding right out of the box in grade school. That is going to be something as a language that all humans in the next generation of people who are alive are going to have to know something about programming. And I think it's almost like coding isn't that hard, but understanding the basis of how machines function. Not that you're going to be able to fix them or whatever, but you're going to have a more tribal knowledge about how you can take robots and robotic controls and over the horizon controls. I speak about that. What does it mean to have the ability to manage something over the horizon that I can sit at a computer and actually manipulate a machine 500 miles away? Those things are going to be a reality, and in a lot of cases they already are. And I think that we have to embrace this change, not worry about whether or not it's going to displace the future
Right.
worker.
Yeah, absolutely. I could go 9 different directions, but let's just speak to this a minute. Cybersecurity, one of the fastest growing businesses in the world. Hacking, ransom. Is this all going to get worse before it gets better, or through 5G, 6G, and web will that decline?
Encryption. This probably is not a good. This is not a good news nugget, but yeah, post quantum encryption is a serious issue. I can tell you that the federal government, NIST, the NSA, the CIA, all of the major defense organizations are spending a great amounts of money in it. In fact, I helped a startup in Lawrence, Kansas, to use some NSA code to be placed in software kernels or in silicon kernels to not monitor incursions, but to measure them. There's going to be tremendous opportunities for investment in that space, because with post-quantum encryption, the deal is this: the bad people are already taking data. They're already going out and grabbing data from large databases and not doing nothing with it. Actually, it's copying and pasting it into another data structure and leaving it set and waiting for quantum to be able to break, the current encryption methods and digest that data. That's a reality. Now, the question will be is how long is that going to take for that to be evident, and will that data be even worth anything at that point? But cyber, cyber insurance, cyber crypto technologies, there, I don't know that there can be enough said that money needs to be invested in that, knowledge needs to be gained in that, and that is a significant opportunity in the future for companies to actually really, really become highly profitable in coming up with ways to protect privacy, security, protect your data, banking, obviously, and the finance industry. It's being invested in heavily today. But I think that we always think that cyber is somebody else's problem to solve. It's not ours. And the companies that are able to come and put cyber and crypto in our day-to-day structure are going to be the ones who really, really benefit from the incursions and the risk that we have from the bad actors.
I'm gonna say, I mentioned this to you, I think, at one time. I'm gonna keep it real simple. Whoever shared it on Twitter or wherever I read it uh, simplified it, but the concern that quantum computing uh, could penetrate Bitcoin, could corrupt it. And I think it's your opinion that that's impossible. But before I address that, the response by this person was, "Hey, if I have access to a quantum computer that can steal assets, I'm going to go for uh, all the cash in the banks and the stock market and land titles and everything else before I mess with Bitcoin." What would be your response to that?
Yeah, and then that's actually, that's an interesting observation, and it is what is commonly said. The thing that quantum, for those who can afford to get onto a quantum machine and actually do quantum compute and create quantum coding, uh, for them to spend the money to go after a data structure today, it's not a cheap date. You have to have a significant bankroll to be able to log on to the quantum machine in North Carolina, University of North Carolina. You have to have significant assets to be able to rent time off the IBM. The Q100 that Google has won't even let you do it. So access to those types of machines is going to be probably to some degree restricted only by the cost to access it and perhaps even eventually regulation. The worry that would be is the synonym machines. You can today rent time that gives you the ability to function like quantum but not do the quantum speed. There's more danger in that. And they're going to be the ones, those are the guys who are sitting in their mom's basement and in their underwear trying to figure out how to do quantum computing. But right now, within NIST, within the federal government, there's actually 4 projects underway to deal with post-quantum encryption. And they're reevaluating all the current encryption methods, including ledger technologies. And I would suggest that in the next 2 years, they're going to have some new standards come out that will be able that industry will be able to apply to their data structures to prevent from having those incursions. But the bigger problem is someone who takes your data and tells them it's encrypted and I'm not going to give it to you unless you give me, 500 coin. Those situations, those are more dangerous to us as individuals than anything that's going to happen in the ecosystem in terms of banking or federal government or those types of things. I think we see a lot of that. Hospitals, particularly, are targets by enemy states that gather their data and demand ransom for it. And I think that's probably going to be the first major issue that we see societally as a real problem that has to be solved, rather than the big targets towards blockchain.
You put a time frame on the next web and 6G technology. I think you threw out 2 years and 4 years in those time frames. Um, one of my staff people, not to get into the weeds here, I'd probably have to come up with a lot more disclosures, but they named a big bank or big financial firm trading bonds on Ethereum. How far away the idea that all assets owned by somebody and identified, through ledger technology in these networks, how far away do you think that is? It's my opinion that it's being built, but how far away are we from that being common?
Um, an interesting, no, it's an interesting proposition in terms of title. Before that happens, so distributed ledger technology, blockchain technologies, basically are simply three things. It defines an asset, it defines a participant, and it defines a transaction. But before we go to that stage that you say, there has to be this notion of perfected identity. And identity happens to be the predicate upon what some of the next iterations of ledger technology look like. Identity of silicon. Today, if you buy a Lenovo laptop and you log on to Lenovo or Intel, the federal government tells you, using a quorum ledger backend, which is an Ethereum extraction, where the silicon was made. Because we cannot buy Chinese manufactured silicon. At least the federal government can't. We can, we shouldn't. And so identity down to the silicon level has already begun. So now that's just processing systems. But the true identity of my car as a system with 50 processors on it, 500,000 lines of code, in the future as being an insured and licensed component, identity for that car doesn't exist other than the serial number. And so there's going to be a lot more work that's going to start taking place by numbers of different organizations to start helping with the notion of identity. So if that is true, so a large shoe manufacturer from the West Coast was, I happened to sit in on an one-day executive briefing with them. They make shoes. You can probably guess one of them, the names of them. And I asked the question of the CTO, just a marvelous person, a delightful woman. I said, what's the mission statement of your company? And I thought, what a dumbass question. She's going to say to make better shoes. She said, to establish truth. To establish truth. So I said, okay, well, that's very interesting. She said, going forward, we're going to create identities of each pair of our shoes, tennis shoes, so that we know person who buys them will provision them to themselves with the handset, and now they know how many miles you've walked in the shoe. And when you hit so many miles, they're going to send you a nicely written text saying you've put 50 miles on your shoes or 500. Why don't you bring them back in, and we're going to give you a brand new pair of shoes for 50% off, because they can identify the shoe and they can identify me as the owner. Those two assets are brought together as a participant. Now the transaction is they're going to give me a huge discount and trading in my shoes. I'm going to give them my shoes. So I asked her the question, what are you going to do with all these used shoes? She says, well, we're going to give them to the homeless, because by giving them away, we get a huge tax deduction as a contribution. Because we can prove we made the shoe, we can prove it was used, and we can prove to whom we're giving it. Now, that's identity. And so when we start thinking about those transactions, that is a shift in value, where I bought something for a certain amount of money, I consumed it, and now it's worth a little bit less. But now I've given it a whole new life using that same identity. The generation effect of investment is really relevant going forward. I can tell you stories about how Bobcat, the skid steer loader manufacturer in North Dakota, has 7 generations of how a Bobcat skid steer works and is sold, and can tell you the depreciation life cycle of that machine to the point where it starts to appreciate. It is really remarkable, because in that machine, they have placed a register, a logging system of 47 different things that it does. So that if I buy a Bobcat that is 10 years old, I can pull off on that machine every major event that it has: overpressure, overheating, underheating, hard starting, engine repair. I know the life of that machine. Now it's had maintenance, but now I know how much value that maintenance is put back into the machine. And used Bobcats appreciate and don't depreciate because of identity.
Yeah. I we have a theme around here of deflationary, or technology is deflationary. And in the case of healthcare and a lot of things, we hope that things become more affordable. You know, I can talk about the heating and cooling of your house and the technology developments there and stuff like that. And the we can get deep into that side. But as far as almost protecting your investment or a consumer, the analogy that I've had before, it's and I think you just more or less said this. Using the skid loader, much better application. But I walk into Nebraska Furniture Mart, have a couch delivered to my house, and find out it don't fit. We don't like the way it looks. Didn't get on the computer to design the room in the showroom to not purchase the couch in the first place. And basically, the idea of you drive it off the lot, it's 50% depreciation immediately.
Yeah.
Uh, this type of technology would protect your assets that way. You know,
It is most definitely that case. So this notion of deflationary components, that is the effect, but that usually is for organizations trying to drive to scale, and to try to get more machines created and sold at less cost because you're driving a scale. Um, but identity, though, is a little bit. Today we don't have that in consumables. I you know I think we can probably visit about it on another podcast at some point. How some of the organizations today who are making soda pop, how they want to actually allow you to own a bottle of soda, the plastic bottle or a can, with a blockchain identity on a bottle itself, identity down to a consumable. So in the case of the sofa, yeah, the sofa may not have a serial number because it just basically assembled and put into a truck. But in the future, it might. And in the future, you're going to want to, because if I trade that or if I turn it back in for some value, someone is going to need to know the history, the DNA, where did it come from? Yeah. That I think is where, and I have heard this a lot from large organizations that say that they want to have a better way to know for what they have made, where it goes, how it's used, what is it used for, estate, uh, and in the case of the Bobcat loader, use that over and over again. In other words, why should things lose significant, unless they're basically garbage and trash and all you got to do is recycle them. But even with recycling, that's becoming a major big deal with the federal government. If I can identify something that I purchased from someone and there was carbon input into the product, the government wants to give you money back for recycling it. And I think identity down to a bottle of pop is clearly in the next 3 to 5 years going to be in existence. And all of these bottles and glasses and cans, you take them back to the recycler, you're going to get money back for doing that because they can prove where they came from.
yeah. Before you brought up the Bobcat skid loader, I should have let you know that Caterpillar and Kubota are sponsoring this podcast.
Okay. Well, they're good loaders as well,
I
right?
just had to put
I don't.
I had to put a plug in
You
for
do.
our local
There you
clients that
go.
work for those
Yeah,
organizations.
definitely. No, I got you on that. I worked for Melrose Bobcat for 13 years. I was a product manager for him, so I know a little bit about the skid loader business. Yep.
This is a taste of what you're going to hear February 10th if you get an invitation to our hedge fund. But I'll close with something funny, Lyle. And then as soon as we hang up here, I got a dozen questions for you. And but the we when somebody retires working with a financial advisor in Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, wherever they retire and they want to maybe remodel their kitchen or buy a Harley or something along those lines. Uh, the number of men that have retired here in Salina, Kansas. Them and their wife come in, and they're going to do one grab before they put the rest of the money to work, and that's to buy a skid loader. That is I think our clientele by far owns more skid loaders than they do Harley Davidson motorcycles.
There you
Yeah,
go. All right.
the demographics of Kansas. So, thank you so much for this afternoon or this evening on the front porch, and we're looking forward to seeing you here in just a few days. Thanks, Lyle.
You're welcome.